Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Alliance's webinar series. Today's webinar, History of the Disability Rights Movement, will be presented by Nell. My name is Christine Beck. I am the Organization Director for the Illinois Self-Advocacy Alliance, and I'll be the facilitator for today's webinar. As a reminder, all attendees are in listen-only mode. If you wish to communicate with myself or Nell, the presenter, please type it in using your control panel chat box. This webinar is being recorded and it will be posted on the Alliance's website for your viewing pleasure 24/7. Today is Thursday, May 2nd, 2019, and we're glad that you've joined us. A little bit about the Alliance. We are the Illinois Self-Advocacy Alliance. We call ourselves the Alliance for short. And we are a network of advocates, allies, and self-advocacy groups all around Illinois. Our vision and mission. Our vision is for self-advocates to work together to get the support we need and to live the life we want to live in the community. Our mission is to speak up for ourselves and each other while working together to make changes in our communities and in Illinois. Our focus is on empowering people to speak up and speak out about what they want and need, what they don't want and don't need, to action plan their goals, and to participate in advocacy at the personal, agency, community, and statewide levels. We do this in a lot of different ways. We support local self-advocacy groups. We work together on important issues, and we offer networking, advocacy, and learning opportunities through monthly webinars, monthly newsletters, the Alliance Ambassador Leadership Program, and our Training Institute. As I mentioned, the Alliance is a network of self-advocates and self-advocacy groups, and we have groups all over Illinois. We have groups up in Zion and McHenry, in Dixon, and Chicago and the surrounding areas are well represented with groups in Alsip, Brookfield, the city of Chicago, Chicago Heights, and Homewood. We have member groups in Rock Island, Pontiac, Galesburg, Bloomington, Beardstown, Jacksonville, Decatur, and Monticello. And towards the southern Illinois area, we have member groups in Alton, Edwardsville, Charleston, and Paris. I like to say, no matter where you live, no matter where you work, there's probably a member group near you. And if there isn't a member group, the Alliance can help you start a group. So just let us know. We are glad to help you. And with that, I'd like you to meet our presenter, Nell. Take it away, Nell.
Hello, everyone. I'm Nell Koneczny, as Christine wonderfully introduced. I use she, her pronouns, which I forgot to include on this slide, actually. On this slide, there's an image of me. I am a white woman with thick-rimmed black glasses, thick black hair that's pretty short. I am wearing a white shirt with a striped pattern and a black and gold bow tie in the image. I am actually currently a master's candidate in the Department of Disability and Human Development at the University of Illinois at Chicago, which is how I've been able to get involved and learn about a lot of disability rights history, especially because I am also a teacher as a teaching assistant for the 101 course at UIC, which is about disability in U.S. society. I am also the incoming accessibility and meetings coordinator for the American Anthropological Association, and I'll actually be starting that job in June after I complete the master's degree this semester, which is super exciting. But all right, so starting off for the webinar, we're going to do a bit of speak up and speak out. And my first question for everyone is, what does DRM stand for?
All right, thanks, Nell. So this is your turn to speak up and speak out. A lot of times we use that alphabet soup, and we need to make sure we understand, what does DRM stand for? So go ahead and type in your answer using your control panel. We will read your answers out loud. Any answer you have is the right answer for you. So please speak up and speak out and let us know. What does DRM stand for? All right. And from Change to Independence Altogether, that is one of our member groups in the Bloomington Normal area. We have this answer: Disability Rights Movement. Disability Rights Movement. We'll keep this open just for a couple more seconds. I know that people are probably talking and deciding, what does that mean? You're gonna type it in, and we can all learn with and from each other. So again, what does DRM stand for? We already heard from one of our member groups. They said it stands for Disability Rights Movement. Does anybody else have another definition? All right, I don't see that anybody else is chiming in, but if they do, we will certainly read that out loud. Oh, I knew as soon as I said it. All right, Heather says, that's a new one for me. And you know what? Thank you, Heather, for sharing that, because this may be new to some folks. So thank you for letting us know that this is new for you. All right. So now I'm going to have you take it away.
Great. Well, thank you to everyone who chimed in, and thank you, Christine, for leading that discussion, because yes, the DRM stands for Disability Rights Movement. And so that's what the entire webinar is about today, the Disability Rights Movement. And the reason I asked this question at the beginning is so we could all ground ourselves, avoid alphabet soup, and be aware of, I might switch back and forth between Disability Rights Movement and DRM when I'm speaking about the Disability Rights Movement. So I'm glad that this is an opportunity for some people to learn about the shortening of the Disability Rights Movement. Let's go ahead and move on. So the next questions that I had, or the next question rather, is, who are some major players that you know from the disability rights movement? And you are absolutely welcome to include disability rights activists from today, because the disability rights movement is still ongoing and changing, and people are still being involved with these issues.
All right, thanks, Nell. Here's another opportunity for you to speak up and speak out. And so who are some major players that you know in the disability rights movement? And feel free to include people from today. It's not just in the past, it's today. And there's going to be some players we know moving forward into our future. So go ahead and talk amongst yourselves. Use the control panel to let us know who you think are some of the major players in the disability rights movement, or as we learned, DRM. DRM. And I'm sure there's lots of great conversation going on. I can't wait to hear some of your ideas on who the major players are. All right, we'll keep it open for, oh, there you go. All right. Oh, this is from Heather. Thank you, Heather. Heather says, Temple Grandin is one of my favorite speakers. Temple Grandin is one of my favorite speakers. Thank you for sharing that, Heather. Thank you for speaking up and speaking out. Would anyone else like to share who are some major players that you know? Maybe you don't know them personally. Maybe you know of them. You've learned about them. Who are some major players? All right, we've got somebody else who'd like to share. Cheryl, thank you. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it properly. Cheryl or Sherelle. Yes, I like Temple too. So again, they're referencing Temple Grandin. Thank you very much. Yes, the second one. Thank you, Sherelle. I appreciate you helping me learn how to say your name properly. Thank you so much. All right, I think we're going to go ahead and move on now.
Sounds great. Thank you to everyone for contributing. I'm glad that Temple Grandin came to everyone's mind as an important activist. I won't be speaking much about her contributions in the webinar, but that does not mean that she and her work are not important. It just means that that work did not get onto this timeline and the way that the disability rights movement's history has been framed yet. And she's contemporary. She's modern day. So she's still making history. So we're going to frame this webinar by talking about the disability rights movement as the three waves. So basically that means that there were three sets of the disability rights movement as a way to understand how the disability rights movement grew and developed. So wave one was the parents leading and making change and encouraging change for their children with disabilities. And we'll get into more detail about their contributions in a few slides. We'll actually get into more detail about each of these waves throughout the entirety of the webinar. So wave one is parents. Wave two is adults with disabilities, and that's what the bulk of this presentation will be discussing, because that's what a lot of the disability rights movement historians talk about and look into and understand. And then the third wave is the collaborations that took place between adults with disabilities, parents, and professionals. And so those are still ongoing today. And that these waves doesn't mean that these people are no longer involved. It just means that this is how the disability rights movement evolved into what it is. So this idea of the three waves of the DRM was established by Valerie Leiter in 2004, who is a disability scholar in disability studies. So prior to getting into each of the waves, I want to highlight some of the important DRM policy successes, starting with 1973, when the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 was passed, which included Section 504. Section 504 was essentially the policy that established and guaranteed civil rights for disabled people in the United States. And this happened specifically in 1977 following the Section 504 sit-ins, which we'll go into more detail later. But I want to note that this was a cross-disability effort and that there were disabled people from all sorts of communities working together to make sure that this civil rights law protecting disabled people in America was passed. Following that, in 1975, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, which is now the IDEA, or the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, was passed. And we'll talk about this in more detail later also, but what the important thing to note right now is that this followed the success of Section 504 and was passed as a result of parents' efforts attempting to really make sure that their children had the right to education and had the right to be taught in schools, in public education settings with every other student who was not disabled. So the next part of the important DRM policy successes happened in 1990 which is the Americans with Disabilities Act. And the Americans with Disabilities Act is truly understood as a monumental, incredibly important part of ensuring that disabled people are included and involved in our communities, and is such a landmark policy that the people born after 1990 are known as the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act generation. And so this act was pushed forward and successfully enacted because of disability rights activists, and especially because of Capitol Crawl. We will also talk about that later. And then in 2008, the Americans with Disabilities Act Amendments Act, so the ADA Amendments Act, was passed, which was a result of this desire to improve the ADA and to limit the misinterpretation of the law, which then actually limited the rights and limited the opportunities disabled people who the law was considering not disabled to be able to be involved. So the ADAA was passed to avoid limiting these rights. And it was passed with the efforts by the National Council on Disability and the Consortium for Citizens with Disabilities. We will also talk about that in more detail later. So let's go on and start with the first wave. Wave one, parents. So parents' movements really started in the early 1900s, and one of the most well-known parents' movements that was started is the ARC, which is an organization for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Their logo is on this slide. And in the early 1930s and the 1950s, small local support groups began to gather of parents to talk about ways to support their children with disabilities. At that time, the small local support groups developed and grew into the organization then called the NARC. NARC stood for the National Association of Our Word Children, and so since then it has been renamed into the ARC for short to recognize that history but not use offensive language. The other parents' movements that really had a lot of success and a lot of support that led to greater support for disabled children were parents from the Easter Seals, which was initially called the National Society for Crippled Children, parents in the United Cerebral Palsy organization, parents who are parts of the National Alliance on Mental Illness, and the Association of Persons with Severe Handicaps, TASH. And some of these organizations developed out of the initial, developed later on, not initially in this 1930s, 1950s timeframe, but they are still important in having pushed forward legislature and providing support for disabled children. So one of the legislative successes by parents was actually in 1975 under the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, which was mentioned earlier. This act was later renamed into the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, the IDEA, in 1990. And this act was created to ensure that children with disabilities were provided a free and appropriate public education. So again, alphabet soup, FAPE, in the least restrictive environment, LRE, to every child with a disability. And so this act really ensured that children who were formerly not being permitted to enter public schools would have that right to go into these schools and get the supports necessary in the least restrictive environments. And so they had the same access to the same opportunities as non-disabled children. So the legislative success by parents of the IDEA, and which was originally the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, is that this act was made of 4 parts. Part A is all about the general information about the law. Part B is assistance and details for how to implement these rules and regulations for education. And so parts A and parts B are actually the more well-known and the more weighted aspects that have the greater amount of detail in this legislation. Part C is for infants and toddlers, which includes kids 0 through 3. So this legislation ensured that no one would get left behind and that no one would be unincluded just because of age even. And Part D then outlined federally funded national support programs. So as I mentioned, Wave 1, it's really crucial, all the work that the parents have done to ensure that the IDEA was passed and everything else they are doing. But there's not going to be as much information about it because of the amount of work that has been done focusing on Wave 2 and the work that adults with disabilities have done. So we're going back again to the early 1900s. At the same time as parents were getting started, there were disability and issue-specific groups that developed. And what I mean by disability-specific is that there were groups of people who had the same disability, the same impairment, who worked together and created organizations together. And issue-specific would be related to specific issues related to, for example, veteran issues or labor issues that also incorporated disability issues. And so on this slide, there's an image of a group of men in uniforms, and one of them has a cane, and the sign that they are holding says, "Don't pity a disabled man, find him a job." So some of the groups included the League of the Physically Handicapped in 1935. This group was developed following the Great Depression and especially following the Works Progress Administration protests. Many people were struggling to find work, and disabled people in particular were finding it even more difficult. And so they developed the League of the Physically Handicapped to really fight for access to those jobs. Another group was organized labor and disability activism that occurred in 1945, and they used disability as a metaphor of class injustice, meaning that people who were laboring, people who were in physically taxing jobs were more likely to become disabled, and so they were using that as a way of understanding the differences between classes, people who work and people who are being worked for. This then also developed into the American Federation of the Physically Handicapped. And then the National Federation of the Blind developed in the 1950s, and they've done a lot of work proposing federal bills to protect blind citizens of the United States. So then we go to the beginning of the DRM in the 1960s, and I put beginning in quotes specifically because this is what is considered the primary narrative within disability studies historian spaces. So historians who study disability rights movement have typically identified the 1960s as the beginning of the disability rights movement, even though we see that there were disability rights actions and organizations that existed prior to then. Nonetheless, this was a moment when the disability rights movement was really being founded by disabled people for disabled people specifically. And it was about rights and cross-disability issues. It wasn't just about one disability or another. And the reason the DRM, historians identify the reason for the development of this is a result of the rehabilitation camps and the experiences of disabled youth. So disabled youth were put into rehabilitation camps together. They shared similar experiences of going to these segregated spaces that were specifically built for them. And through those opportunities, they had the chance to talk to each other about their identities, about their experiences as disabled people, about their similarities, about their differences, about the things that they understood because they were disabled and in these camps. And they developed a community, they developed a culture. And from this, as these youth grew, they entered higher education, or they fought to enter higher education. And so protests in institutions of higher education, such as the University of California in Berkeley, started to happen, where disabled students would demand their rights and demanded to be a part of campus life, not just rights to access the education, but to be a part of campus life. So a disabled student organization in Berkeley that was founded was called the Rolling Quads. it was founded by disability rights activist Ed Roberts, who we will speak about a little bit more in detail later. And they really went around basically destroying curbs, trying to ensure that curbs would become curb cuts and be available so that disabled people, specifically wheelchair users, could enter and access these spaces, so that wheelchair users wouldn't necessarily be in segregated spaces in like hospital units instead of in the dorms with their peers who were non-disabled. So as these young adults who were protesting these issues in higher education grew and left higher education, they then developed into larger organizations outside of university spaces. And so the independent living movement developed out of this also, which is alongside with the disability rights movement. And so centers for independent living, such as in Chicago, Access Living developed. The Disability Law Resource Center developed. The Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund, DREDA, developed. And all of these organizations worked together to focus on disability issues. So on this slide, we have some pictures of these protests at in institutions of higher education, specifically related to Ed Roberts. So in the left picture, there's one picture of Ed Roberts and another wheelchair-using man in front of a stadium. In the center, there's a group of wheelchair users and standing people with signs. And these are all black and white photos. And then on the right, there's a picture of also Ed Roberts with a man who has a service dog with him. And so these are just some examples of the protests taking place in these institutions of higher education. So a few major figures, and I want to be really clear that these are not the only disability rights activists, that these are not the only people who matter in the history, but these are some big names that are really important to keep in mind and to remember as discussing disability rights history specifically. So there was Ed Roberts, there is Judy Heumann, and there was Brad Lomax. And each of the following slides will give a little bit more detail about each of these individuals. So one of the major figures is Ed Roberts. He is frequently referenced to as the father of the disability rights movement. And one of the bigger things that he fought for was gaining access to college dorms. There's a picture of Ed Roberts to the right. He's a little older in this picture. He's a white man using a ventilator, and you can see that he is sitting in a wheelchair. And the work he did really ensured that college students with disabilities could be more integrated in their college spaces. And he continued from that to develop into also doing work on the independent living movement, developing centers for independent living, and just continued to be a disability rights activist figure outside of these college spaces. But his first major really push was gaining access to the University of California, Berkeley, and demanding to be on campus and not in a hospital at the university. So then we have Judy Heumann. She has a very long history and is still ongoing as a disability rights activist today. But some of the major things that I think are important to keep in mind and to remember about her contributions is that as she went into higher education to get a degree in becoming a teacher. And after she became a teacher, she was actually denied the license because she was considered a fire hazard. Following this incredibly clear moment of discrimination, she pursued a lawsuit, and she won a lawsuit in New York to become a teacher and to gain her access to the license. And so that was one of her major moments in disability rights history, which basically established that yes, disabled people can indeed be teachers, that disabled people are not risks to their students. for being disabled. So another major contribution she's done is she led the San Francisco Section 504 sit-in. We haven't had a chance to go into the sit-ins in detail yet, but those will be at later slides. But essentially, she led a 28-day sit-in that ensured that Section 504's regulations would actually be respected and implemented. So she was one of the leaders with that, alongside with Kitty Cone. And she's still an ongoing disability rights activist. She was present during the protests, I believe in 2017, fighting against the dismantling of the Affordable Care Act, or also known as Obamacare, to ensure that disabled people did not lose their access to health care and to the rights associated with health care. She's done many other things, as I noted, but these are some of the main things I wanted to highlight for her work prior to going to the next person. The next person is Brad Lomax. Brad Lomax was really also critical in the Section 504 sit-ins. I know I keep referencing this and we haven't talked about it yet, but hopefully whenever we talk about it, these people will come to the forefront of your mind. He was a member of the Black Panther Party, and his work for the Section 504 sit-ins ensured that the disabled activists who were occupying a federal building had access to food. He worked with the Black Panther Party so that people who were sitting in and occupying these spaces would be able to eat and have the nutrition they needed, because the Black Panther Party sent them food. And so he really developed a cross-movement solidarity between disability and racial rights activists, and really wanted to bridge that gap because he himself was a Black wheelchair-using disabled man. And so to the right, there's an image of Brad Lomax, and it's a black and white picture. He's holding a Support 504 protest sign. He's in his wheelchair, and he's kind of leaned back with his leg crossed over, standing in front of some buildings, or sitting in front of buildings. So beyond these individual figures, one of an important disability rights organization who has really pushed for a lot of issues and made a lot of important issues known is ADAPT. So to the right, there's an image of their logo, which is the wheelchair-using symbol of a person, a silhouette of a person in a wheelchair, except they've had hands added on, and their hands are lifted above them. The chains are being broken. It says "Free Our People" and ADAPT. ADAPT is known as the militant wing of the DRM, precisely because they have led a lot of nonviolent direct actions, which are civil disobedience, in ways that they have interrupted and disrupted everyday life for people to make clear that disabled people have rights and should be included. So ADAPT really started as a result of fighting for the right to gain access to public transportation. The Chicago Transit Authority, the CTA, they pursued some lawsuits against the Chicago Transit Authority in the 1980s, precisely to gain access to public transportation along with non-disabled people. And they are still a very active organization, still doing a lot of work. Right now they're working on Stop the Shock, and working on also protecting healthcare, and working on the Disability Integration Act, all of these, which I will share later also. So they have planned rallies, they do sit-ins, they do protests, they do campaigns, and more national field events. And now we can switch to the slide. Sorry about that, Christine. And so this image is just of a group of ADAPT protesters sitting in wheelchairs in front of a Greyhound bus. It's a black and white picture, and they have signs reading "We Will Ride," "Wheeling Warriors," "Life on Wheels," and really trying to emphasize that they also have a right to public transportation. So, the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. This act really shifted the blame from the individual to society and identified the problem within society as discrimination. So this act really focused on, so the Rehabilitation Act in general was providing supports for disabled people, but there is one aspect of it that did do that shift. Originally, it was vetoed by President Nixon in 1972. When it was vetoed, Judy Heumann, along with 80 activists, stopped traffic on Madison Avenue in New York City. And following that, it was enacted because of Congress's vote against Nixon's veto. So it was actually Congress that enacted the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. And on this slide, there's a picture of Judy Heumann smiling. So Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act reads specifically that no otherwise qualified individual with a disability in the United States shall, solely by reason of his or her disability, be excluded from the participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance or under any program or activity conducted by any executive agency or by the United States Postal Service. This was the first policy regarding civil rights for people with disabilities, establishing that people with disabilities in the United States did have civil rights. So there was a delayed enforcement of Section 504. There was this lack of enforcement and regulations of the Rehab Act, and it was this lack of enforcement was taking place under President Jimmy Carter, specifically under Joseph Califano, who became the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, the HEW. This was the main person that disability rights protesters were pushing back against to enact and to enforce Section 504. So there was a deadline given by the protesters to provide regulations for the Rehab Act by April 4th. And so after the Rehab Act was not being enforced, by April 4th, on April 5th, 10 demonstrations across 10 different cities erupted, and these were known as the Section 504 sit-ins. So with the Section 504 sit-ins, as I mentioned, there were 10 of them, but the main one that people really usually remember is the San Francisco, California sit-in, because protesters occupied the HEW federal office building, the Health, Education, and Welfare building, for 28 days. They stayed from April 5th until May 1st in 1977, and they basically shut down all work taking place in that building for 28 straight days. They showered there, they ate there, they worked there, and they were there because they were demanding their rights. They were there demanding to have access to the same opportunities that non-disabled citizens of America had. And so while on April 28th, 1977, the regulations were issued, protesters remained until the regulations were reviewed and approved in Washington, D.C. So these disabled activists were staying in this building for 28 days to ensure that nobody would be left out and that people with disabilities could have access to federally funded spaces. On this slide, there is a black and white image of some of these protesters holding various protest signs. On this slide, there is an image of a black and white picture of multiple wheelchair users sitting in front of a Capitol building, and behind one of the wheelchair users is the sign, "We shall overcome." And on this slide, there is a black and white picture of more of these protesters, some wheelchair users and standing protesters alike, surrounding a desk at the building, actually. And so whenever I was referencing earlier what Brad Lomax was doing, I was referencing how because these people were staying in a federal building for 28 days, they needed access to food, because if they left, they would not be able to re-enter the building. They were there occupying the building to make a point that their rights had to be respected. So wave 3, collaborations with adults with disabilities, parents, and professionals. And so in this part, we're going to talk about both about the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Americans with Disabilities Amendments Act, because at this time, a lot of collaboration was taking place between these various groups of people who were interested in protecting and supporting disabled people. So the Americans with Disabilities Act really started with some negotiations in the late 1980s. There were policy discussions taking place which involved Congress people from both parties, which means that this was actually policy that was bipartisan. It was drafted under President Ronald Reagan, but as President George H.W. Bush was beginning to do his election cycle and start his presidential campaign, it was taken on as a major cause by him. And so because of his work, or because of his interest in supporting the disability community could push him to make sure that the act would be enacted. So this act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, was specifically pushed forward by two disability rights activists, Justin Dart Jr., who is known as the godfather of the ADA. There's an image of him on the slide. He is a white man with a cowboy hat and glasses. And then Patricia Wright, who was known as the general of the ADA because of just how militant she was in making sure that this law was passed to protect disabled people, not just in federally funded spaces like Section 504, but in all state, local, private employment spaces available so that disabled people would not be discriminated against. And Section 504 was critical as roots for this legislation. Section 504 established that yes, disabled people do have rights, do have access to civil rights, and that these rights need to be expanded so that disabled people can navigate and move within all spaces without having to fight to be present because of their disability. So the Americans with Disabilities Act was signed on June 26, 1990. And here is a color picture of George H.W. Bush signing the act on in front of the White House lawn, I believe. And there are two wheelchair users sitting next to him, one of them including Justin Dart Jr. So the Americans with Disabilities Act prohibits discrimination and ensures equal opportunity for persons with disabilities in employment, state and local government services, public accommodations, commercial facilities, and transportation. It also mandates the establishment of TDD and telephone relay services. So again, it really expanded the civil rights that were guaranteed by Section 504 into all of these spaces across America. So while the Americans with Disabilities Act is the law that got passed, the reason it got passed was because disability rights activists were really pushing for it. Just like disability rights activists sat in a federal building for 28 days to make a point, disability rights activists did another action on March 12, 1990, which is about 3 months before it got passed, to identify that there is discrimination built into the very foundation of the United States. So the Capitol Crawl, as this act was called, or this action was called, is a rally that occurred with multiple speeches by different disability rights activists of all ages and all backgrounds. There were 60 disabled activists who crawled up the steps of the U.S. Capitol building without the use of their wheelchairs and mobility devices. And so on these pictures, there's a black and white picture and a color picture of the Capitol building stairs. And on these pictures, it's clear there are people who are crawling up. They are sitting and crawling up using their legs, using their butts, and some of them still holding onto their assistive devices. And so this action was done to really indicate the segregation taking place of disabled people. And so when George H.W. Bush signed it, he made note that this act did prevent or would be the beginning of preventing further segregation of disabled people. So the ADA was passed in 1990, and then the ADA Amendments Act was beginning to be discussed about 15 years later. In 2004, the National Council on Disability determined that the ADA needed to be further supported and clarified because of a number of court cases that were taking place that determined that certain people did not deserve protections under the ADA. And so after this was identified in 2006, the Consortium for Citizens with Disabilities worked directly with the disability rights community to identify areas for improvement in the ADA. And so in these discussions about the ADA, about what was missing, about how it wasn't fulfilling its role as civil rights legislation for disabled people in America, this was actually a coalition of work between businesses and disability communities. So it wasn't just the disability community who was involved, it was also businesses who wanted to support the disability community. So the ADA Amendments Act was really created to expand and clarify the definitions of disability and major life activities and functions to protect more people from discrimination. So for example, there were two really well-known court cases. One is Sutton and another, I actually do not remember the other one right now, but these court cases identified that there were individuals who were not protected under the ADA because of a limited understanding of what major life activities and functions included. So one of these people included an individual who filed a lawsuit for being fired for not getting the supports that she needed as a person who needed glasses. She was legally blind, but because of the glasses, they did not consider her disabled. And to prevent these kind of situations, the ADA Amendments Act was passed to prevent people from saying that anyone with diabetes, anyone with HIV/AIDS, anyone with cancer would not be protected under ADA, along with other things. So it was officially introduced and also signed in 2008. And so this picture is a color photo of George W. Bush, so George H.W. Bush's son, signing the ADA Amendments Act actually behind his desk in the White House, surrounded by a group of white men and one white woman with a cane. So this indicates, so the ADA Amendments Act was pushed forward specifically because people recognized the ADA was still not enough and was not doing what it needed to do to protect every member of the disability community. So that all is a very broad overview of disability rights history, of even from the early 1900s to more recent years, as little as a decade ago. But that doesn't mean that disability rights issues are not going on and continuing, and that we as disability rights activists are not continuing to make this history and to make things better for our community. And so the ongoing policy struggles and activism taking place since 2017 include the Disability Integration Act, which is really pushing to support community living for disabled people instead of focusing on continuing the institutionalization of disabled people. In 2017, there were a number of protests against the ACA repeal, so the Affordable Care Act repeal and Medicaid cuts, which Judy Heumann, who was a part of the Section 504 sit-ins, was actively a part of. In 2017 and 18, there was the action saying vote no on HR 620, the ADA Education and Reform Act. And so this means that the ADA was being once again revisited, but instead of being recognized as still limiting the rights and limiting the opportunities for disabled people, this time it was the reverse, and businesses were attempting to require more paperwork by disabled people to gain access to businesses, basically. And so the disability community really focused on this, and it focused on making sure that ADA would not lose some of its protective status and would lose its teeth because of this proposed legislation. It failed to pass, but many of the disability rights community are worried that it will come back into legislation and be on the floor for a vote again. And then in 2019, what's happening right now is that a lot of different disability rights organizations, including ASAN, ADAPT, so ASAN is Autistic Self-Advocates Network, and ADAPT are really advocating for hashtag Stop the Shock, to have the FDA actively ban the use of electric shock devices, which they have already agreed to do so in 2014. It's just that at this time, these shock devices are still being used 5 years after the FDA agreed that these devices are inhumane and should not be used. So some more major issues today. Healthcare is an ongoing issue that the disability rights community is fighting for. Community living is an ongoing issue that the disability rights community is really focusing on. And so healthcare is really related to the ACA, Medicare for All. Community living is related to the DIA, Disability Integration Act, shock therapy and preventing the use of shock therapy through Stop the Shock. There's a number of disability programs and supports who have their funding at risk currently, which the disability community is really pushing back against. One of the more well-known ones of recently that came up was the risk of the Special Olympics, along with a number of other disability programs. There's issues related to marriage equality, where disabled people lose their access to Social Security after being married. Technological accessibility, so making sure things are available in all formats for screen readers and other people who use different types of accessible technology, and many, many other issues. So there's also a lot of online activism going on Twitter. So there's a logo of Twitter, and Facebook. There's a logo of Facebook, which really provides a chance for community building between people who may not always be able to be present physically in spaces that are primarily activist-based. So there's hashtag CrypTheVote, which was started by Alice Wong, Andrew Poole-Rang, and Greg Barrington. There was hashtag Disability2White, started by Melissa Thompson. So CrypTheVote is all about recognizing that disability issues should be more present in political spaces and discussions. Hashtag Disability2White is the recognition that much of the discussions about disability in all aspects are frequently focused on white people, on white disabled people, and not people of color who also happen to have disabilities. And so this calls attention to that. There's a new hashtag called hashtag Access is Love, which was started by Alice Wong, Mia Mingus, and I apologize for the typo there, and Sandy Ho. And it's really identifying that access is more than ADA compliance. It's about really showing love and respect for disabled people and including them genuinely in communities. There's hashtag Dis the Oscars, so basically started by Imani Barbarin. And so that hashtag really focuses on how the Oscars tend to erase disabled experiences, specifically because non-disabled people tend to be the actors of disabled characters instead of hiring disabled people as those actors. All right, let's do a little bit of speak up and speak out. I know we don't have that much time left, but I would still like to propose these questions for people to think on. So what disability social media hashtags do you like to share with people, or are you involved in? I listed a very short amount in the last slide. So if there's any that you want to share, please go ahead and do so. And what disability rights issues are you working on?
All right, so here's an opportunity for you to speak up and speak out. What disability social media hashtags do you share with people or you are involved in? I know many of you who are on this webinar may be out there doing a lot of social media things on Twitter and maybe Instagram and Facebook and all kinds of social media. And so what are you into? And what disability rights issues are you working on? And I'll just share, as you're thinking about that and you're typing it into your control panel, probably now about 8 to 9 years ago, Illinois self-advocates really spoke up and spoke out and said, we don't like the use of the R word in policies and procedures and in Illinois state statutes. And so you rose up and you were disability rights activists. And so lawmakers heard you and they made changes. And in state statutes that talk about providing services to people who experience disabilities, the R word was removed, and in its place, the words intellectual and developmental disabilities is now used. And that's because of you. Maybe you remember that. And if you were part of that, thank you so much for speaking up and speaking out about that. All right, so from Change to Independence Altogether, a self-advocacy group in the Bloomington Normal area, their big issues is voting, or their big issues are voting and voting registration, making sure that people are registered to vote and their vote counts. And from Tara Ahern, who is the project director for the Illinois Self-Advocacy Alliance, she has a lot of hashtags she uses. Hashtag disability inclusion, hashtag disability pride, hashtag disabled and proud, hashtag disabled life, hashtag disability awareness. And then there's an and sign, disability awareness. Change to Independence Altogether also included hashtag spread the word inclusion. And I know some other self-advocacy groups and some agencies and organizations in Illinois are really into the hashtag more alike than different. Thank you, Heather. And that's through CTF Illinois. Tara Ahern also says sexuality is a big one. House Bill 3299 is current legislation many people are working on so that people with intellectual and developmental disabilities can get sex education if they want it. And another hashtag from Mark First, hashtag they deserve more. People who receive services in Illinois deserve more. And that's what that hashtag is about. So, wow, that's a whole lot of hashtags. Thank you so much, everyone. Whoops, I'm sorry for sharing those. Wow, wow, wow. Anybody else have any hashtags or disability rights issues that they're working on that weren't mentioned? And as you think about it, perhaps you're typing in. I'm going to go to the next slide where Nell can share books if you are into reading and want to read more about the disability rights movement.
Yes, thank you to everyone for sharing those hashtags and the issues that you're all working on. They're so important, and just the best way for us to get the things we need is for each of us to focus on the issues that are closest to us and what we need to get changed, and then we'll be able to work together and get the things done such as we have throughout history as seen on these slides. And so the next two slides are about some book suggestions if you're interested in learning more about the disability rights movement. Before I share the books, I really want to name that one of the things that the disability rights movement historians don't always do a great job at is actually, while there's a lot of discussion about cross-disability issues, there tends to still be a focus on physical and sensory-based disabilities. And so even through this presentation, there was a lot of discussion about wheelchair users, and not as much discussion about, and a lot of discussion about blind people, but not as much discussion about deaf people who also do not always identify as disabled, or about people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, or autistic people, or people with mental illnesses, and a number of others. And so that's something that's really important to remember, I think, is that the disability rights movement can include a lot of pieces that may not yet be recorded, that may not yet be written. But what it has been written and what has been recorded is available through 4 books that I have suggested, and many, many more. So the first 2 visible on this slide include No Pity, People with Disabilities, Forging a New Civil Rights Movement by Joseph Shapiro. So this is a book from 1993, and I'm sure it would be drastically different, written 26 years later. There is a book by Zames and Fleischer, which is called The Disability Rights Movement from Charity to Confrontation. This is the second edition I have suggested. It was initially written much earlier as well. And then there is What We Have Done, An Oral History of the Disability Rights Movement by Fred Pelke. This was written in 2012, and it includes a lot of these histories that were discussed here in more detail. And then most recently in 2015, Leonard Davis, who also happens to be a UIC professor, wrote Enabling Acts, the hidden story of how the Americans with Disabilities Act gave the largest US minority its rights. And so that book is really focused on the Americans with Disabilities Act. And so while we skimmed over it in these slides in this presentation, there's a lot more information available through that book. And so I just want to say thank you to everyone for spending some of your valuable time from your day today with me, as I had the opportunity to share some of this history with you. It's a very long history. Trying to squish over 100 years of history into 1 hour and be meaningful in such a way so that all aspects are included and clear and thorough is really difficult, but I hope that it provided some information for you moving forward to take with you and use. And if you have any questions about this or anything else related to, or want to just connect, and I'm also a disability rights activist, so I'm always trying to expand my network, feel free to email me at my email nkonec2@uic.edu, or follow me on Twitter at AccessNell. Yeah, so I just want to say thank you again for your time, and feel free to reach out with any questions you may have.
Thank you, Nell. And I have a couple more things to share from Heather at CTF. She shared that we sent Halloween pictures with Halloween is scary, #disabilities are not. So thank you for sharing that. That's really neat. And Sherelle said, thanks for a great presentation. Yes. And I'm reminded that we can all be disability rights activists by speaking up and speaking out. We are all part of the movement as we speak up and speak out for the things that are important to us. I know we've been sharing questions, comments, and contributions throughout, and you have Nell's contact information should you continue to have any questions, comments, or contributions. But as we close today, I'd like to thank each and every one of you for taking time out of your day to learn a bit more about disability rights history and the disability rights movement. I know I learned a lot that I didn't know. And to contact the Alliance, our email is info@selfadvocacyalliance.org. Our website is selfadvocacyalliance.org. And you can find us and like us on Facebook by searching for Illinois Self-Advocacy Alliance. And there is a color picture on this screen, there is a white person and he is turned around so we see his back. He is wearing a purple shirt that says with white letters, "Ask me about the Alliance," and his right arm is raised up and his hand is in a fist. And I hope that when that picture was taken, he was saying, "Speak up and speak out." So again, on behalf of the self-advocates, self-advocacy groups, and allies of the Illinois Self-Advocacy Alliance, Nell, thank you so much for your experience and expertise in leading us on today's journey. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.